How's it going, everybody? My name is Quinn Sandler. I'm the founder and CEO of Plantiga. I wanted to personally thank you for joining today's webinar. It's called RSI, What It Is and Why It Is Important for Performance and Recovery. To begin, we're actually going to spend some time and go through some asymmetry norms. These were questions that came up last webinar around some normative values for asymmetry for walking and running. Then we're going to dive deep into measuring jumping and specifically RSI and how to use RSI to monitor and evaluate injury, recovery, and performance. Looking at the attendees is awesome. We have a number of practitioners and health professionals joining us, so athletic trainers and physical therapists from some of our partners and organizations we work with. We have a number of researchers as well. And we actually have a good amount of our individual athletes that we are tracking. So we really thank everybody for joining. A little bit on the speakers today. So first is Dr. Matt Jordan. Matt is Plantiga's VP of Science and Performance. We're very grateful to have Matt's guidance and direction in building out our platform. Matt is a player health and performance consultant to many of the world's largest organizations, both in sport and in military, as well as Lauren Friedman. So Lauren is Plantiga's resident biomechanist, and she comes from an interesting background of biomedical engineering, but also is a dual varsity athlete, so brings a good amount of context in terms of the application of that data. I'm going to jump back on, pun intended, at the end of the session for a Q&A. And with that intro, I'm going to hand it off to Lauren and Matt.
Thanks, Quinn.
So I'll kick it off here. Yeah, thanks very much. Great to be here. It's our second webinar that we've done in the past year, and we're excited here to talk today about this little measure called RSI, which I want you to think of as like the HRV for your muscles, because I know you guys are probably all familiar with HRV, you know, the Whoop band or ring. This is what they measure behind the scenes to monitor your recovery and your wellness. Well, that's essentially what we're doing here with RSI. But first, a little bit about Plantiga. You know, I have to say the technology is pretty impressive. You know, 6-7 years of development to get this little sensor underneath an insole, and you know, to use artificial intelligence to drive all sorts of insights around your health and performance. But I often say it is impressive, but it's the least impressive thing about the company because the main objective now is the movement coaching program. So this sensor and this insole is what connects you to other humans like Lauren and myself, where we help you optimize your movement. We make predictions around how you move to help you lead a better and more high-performing life. And so it's been a real fun transition now that we've got the technology sort of, you know, at this very advanced stage that we're actually living the dream now that we always had, which is connecting people with people through technology. You know, the sort of background of the company, just so you know where we've come from, is we started off very much focused on elite human performance environments. So, you know, some of the biggest professional teams in the world, military organizations, lots of university partnerships. And that's what this technology was built around, was sort of the best in mind in terms of, you know, application. And importantly, our technology continues to be a very big part of many of these organizations, and is just growing even more in the worlds of professional sport. You know, professional athletes are buying this technology to sort of improve their health and performance. You know, military groups and whatnot are very interested in what we do. So I'm gonna throw over here to Lauren. So she's got control of the screen, but we did get a question last time in our last webinar, and it was a great question. Someone said, hey, how do we know with running and walking, how do we know what normal is? And Lauren's going to show you a pretty impressive data set here that can help answer that question. And remember, as we go through, if questions arise and you're like, hey, I would really like to know something about Plantiga, make sure you let us know, reach out, because it's really important to us that we help attend to, you know, the things that matter to you most. And this is just a question that came up last time, and just want to spend a minute on it. So Lauren, I'll throw it to you.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. So, I mean, our goal at Plantiga has always been to provide the highest quality data, and we've done a lot of work internally to validate our metrics and to see what all of these numbers mean in terms of, normal contexts. But we're now reaching out to other universities and we're doing external validation studies. So this is actually from the wearable sensor study that we're doing with Dr. Chris Napier. It's still in progress, but he is a prof at UBC. He's basically an expert in running. And we did a large scale study with him. We've collected on 190 participants of various demographics, but all healthy runners. And so we've collected a bunch of data, and we're just looking at the types of asymmetries that we see in running, and we're trying to establish what the normative values are. So in this table, we've kind of broken it down. You can see the types of asymmetries like load asymmetry. The mean for running was 6.44% with a standard deviation of 4.77%, and for walking 5.81% with standard deviation of 4.16%. And so with this kind of context, you can put the data that you collect yourself, you can have a bit of an idea of what's normal, and what's normal for you may not be exactly what's normal for the group, but at least you'll have a bit of an idea of where you fit into this quite large data set that we've started to collect. So like I said, or like Matt said, we're really interested in catering to what you guys are looking for. So please ask us any questions. And this is from the last webinar, and we'll address any other questions that we might need to collect more data for in the next webinar. But we just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what you're looking at with our asymmetry metrics here.
It's over to me. Here we go. Sorry, I think you might have clicked and maybe I clicked too, Lauren. So there we are. We're on the next, we're on the transition slide. Just to kind of reiterate though, on what Lauren was saying, and just sort of, this has never been done to the best of my knowledge. A commercial device, it's an insole, uses an inertial measurement unit, right? So it's measuring acceleration and position and, angles and whatnot. And, when you get this data, you download these data from say a run sampling 400 times a second. You can imagine the data that you get is just massively complex. It's impossible to know what's what. And the idea of using artificial intelligence to drive insights and to extract the variables that Lauren just showed, the gait biomechanical variables, this is new territory. So the data that you're seeing there is obviously very specific to our system. And yeah, I just want to say that, even for me as a runner, I used to do triathlon. I was actually my main sport when I was in my teens, but I still run. And it's very interesting for me to know when I go for a run, is 7% load asymmetry normal or not? And so with that data that Lauren just shared, obviously you can go back, screen capture it, but that's a good reference point for when you're interpreting your own data. So I want to now shift and talk about this measure called Reactive Strength Index. And like I said, like you say RSI, it's like me saying heart rate variability. Very few people in the world will know what heart rate variability is, HRV, but nearly everybody knows about Whoop, and nearly everybody knows about Oura Ring, and they know that it monitors your recovery. And so I want to focus on the problem that this little measure called RSI solves, because it kind of is like, HRV for your muscles and your bones and your ligaments, especially around the nature of loading and recovery. And so what we use RSI for, it's been used for decades in sport performance settings. As a strength and conditioning coach, this is one of the key metrics that I've been using for 25 years to look at my athletes. But I want to show you over the presentation, along with Lauren, how you can use it to help quantify all kinds of things around your health, performance, and your recovery. So just quick tee up example, and I'm going to speak from the heart here. One of the sports that I've worked a lot with over the years is alpine ski racing. It's a high risk sport, and the images that you're seeing on the bottom are the effects of being in this high risk sport. Is very often these athletes suffer knee injuries, and particularly these anterior cruciate ligament injuries, ACL ruptures, and they are a massive issue not only for skiers but also soccer players, basketball players, NFL football players. It's really almost one of those injuries that when you sustain it, we're not talking about going and putting a Band-Aid on it, right? It's a surgery. It's a long rehabilitation. And what we've talked a lot about in the world of elite sport like a lot of times when if you tear your ACL and you go see your physiotherapist or your physician, you do all your rehab, you get your surgery, what have you, and then at 9 months, maybe they, put you through a battery of tests. It's kind of like passing a final exam, you high five and you go out and you go back and play soccer or whatever you're meant to do. But what you probably don't know is there's actually a really high attrition rate, meaning that a high fraction of people that go back to sport eventually end up suffering a second ACL injury. And very often this happens up to 2 years after that ACL reconstruction. So when you think about this, how does testing at 9 months in a clinic environment really tell you about what's going on 2 years down the road when you maybe eventually suffer a second injury? And what we've written a lot about in the world of elite sport is this idea that we have to monitor our athletes. And I'm not just talking about 1 test, 2 tests, I'm talking about ubiquitous daily monitoring. So every single time you go out and run and jump and play and whatever you're doing, you're monitoring your movement to be able to make sure that things are the way they should be. Just think about driving your car, right? The check engine light pops on. Your engine hasn't fallen out of the bottom of your car yet, hopefully, but it's a prompt. It's like, hey, go see your mechanic because there's something going on here. And that's exactly what monitoring is all about. But you can imagine this is available to all but a few people in the world because you need a lab, you need expertise and whatnot, and it's a real problem. And so back to this world of ACL injury, like what do we do, right? Well, very often if you don't have technology, you measure what you can. You grab a tape measure, you measure a single leg hop for distance, a triple hop. These are common tests that clinicians will use after an ACL injury to see if your right side is like your left side. But I want to show you the problem with that. On the screen, what you're seeing here, it's a study that was done on a pretty large number of individuals who'd had an ACL reconstruction. And what they did was they wanted to compare a whole bunch of test batteries that we commonly use for people with ACL injury. And what they did was follow them over a period of time to go see who eventually goes on to suffer that gruesome second injury. And what's really interesting to know, check this out. So what they're comparing is how far you jump on your right side compared to your left, right? In a whole bunch of single leg tests. I mean, it makes sense, right? You had an ACL injury, so let's jump on your right and jump on your left and see how you do. But what's really interesting is this. So they compare this with what's called a limb symmetry index. It's 100%. That means the right side is the same as my left. And I want you to focus on this column here, which says re-injury. That means this is the column where the individuals actually go on to suffer what we don't want, which is the second ACL injury. And what you'll notice is limb symmetry index, 91%, 94%, 94% for all of our conventional field tests that we often do after an ACL injury. And comparatively, the group that goes on to not suffer the re-injury, actually slightly lower, right? So technically they did worse on the test that's meant to tell you whether or not you're ready to go back. 89%, 91%, 91%. And so riddle me this one. The tests that we're doing don't seem to really discriminate how I'm going to fare after something like an ACL injury. And I'm going to tie this back to RSI in a second. So first, a little bit about like what this is. And I want to just kind of focus in on the 2 tests that you can do with Plantiga. On the left, it's a test called the consecutive counter movement jump test. So here what you'll see, it's relatively long time on the ground, big knee bend, hands on the hips, and you do these 5 jumps in a row. So that's what we call the consecutive counter movement jump test. And then on the right, it's like a pogo hop, right? It's a bouncing type test where this is Lauren, who's on the call doing that. It's like a bouncy style jump test, hands on hips, and you're trying to be like a stiff spring. So these are 2 tests that you can run with the Plantiga system. And they are obviously very informative about all sorts of things. And we're going to tie this back to injury in just a second. So think about it like this. What exactly are we measuring when we look at RSI? Well, really simply put, it's how stiff your suspension is. So imagine like you're driving a squishy 1985 Cadillac versus a really high performance 2021 Audi S4. Your Audi S4's got that tight suspension, right? When you're going around the turn, it rides those corners, and the squishy Cadillac is the soft, floaty ride. And this is what we're looking at when we measure this notion of RSI, the reactive strength index. Sometimes it's called plyometric ability, but you can think about it about the spring stiffness of your lower limbs. It's your suspension, that's what we're testing. There's all kinds of things that go into this. These are very, how do I put it? Like unique human movements, right? It's this idea that you have this stretch of your muscles when you drop down, a shortening of your muscles when you come up. And this image that you see here is just all, for all the people who are on the call who are more the scientists, it's all the physiology that's happening behind the RSI. And remember when I said that RSI was kind of like the HRV for your muscles? Well, this is what it is. We're measuring this highly complex physiological process by a simple jump test. And so it gives us all sorts of information about how individuals are faring. And as you'll see in a little bit, particularly after the case of ACL injuries. Okay, so what are we measuring? So in an RSI, you have two jump types. You're doing this consecutive counter movement jump. It's a little bit longer, more knee bend, and you've got that pogo hop, cyclic hop test. So two different tests, but very, very simply put, what we're measuring is the time that you spend on the ground versus the time that you spend in the air. So we take a ratio of that. So you've got your flight time and your ground contact time. We make a ratio and we can evaluate this thing called RSI, this measure of how stiff your suspension is. So what are the problems we solve? Well, I've already given you one hint. There's going to be something that's going to come up around injuries. I'm going to talk very specifically about ACL injuries, but there's other stuff too. So we're measuring how stiff your suspension is, and I want you to think about it like the HRV for your muscles, because RSI has been used for an eternity in sport performance settings to look at neuromuscular recovery and neuromuscular readiness. And Lauren's going to show you at the end of the talk two case examples, one around how RSI can be used to look at how good your warm-up is, and also the impact of, let's say, a training session on your neuromuscular fatigue. As you're going to see in a couple of slides, it's going to be key for us when we look at recovery after injury, especially ACL injuries. And the last piece about this is, in and of itself, it's a measure of performance. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, because in our movement coaching program, we've got a ton of endurance athletes. We've got athletes who are competing, going to try to race, in Ironmans and high-level endurance runners. A lot of times you think, well, I don't jump, like I'm a runner, right? But it's really interesting to note that RSI is actually a very good correlate for running economy, which is an essential factor for endurance running performance. And obviously, the other piece of the puzzle is you might be in a sport where jumping fast and jumping high are really, really critical for performance. So in and of themselves, in and of itself, RSI is also this really important measure for performance. So back to injury. Remember the start? ACL injuries happen frequently, sort of like passing a final exam. That seems to be how we treat it. Come in at 9 months, do some single leg hops for distance, right? Take a look at how people are moving, good, bad. You head back into your sport. You're actually more at risk to hurt your knee 2 years down the road. And it doesn't seem like a lot of our conventional field tests are really that informative around predicting who might be at risk for a future ACL injury. So I want to talk a little bit about the reactive strength now in the context of the science and how we can use it to monitor recovery after injury. So this is a good friend of mine, Dr. Enda King. He's a physiotherapist and a researcher from the Sports Surgery Clinic in Dublin, Ireland. I had the great pleasure of visiting him and his crew there about 5 years ago. And all I can tell you is it's one of the most impressive data sets that I've seen in the space. 1,400 or more relatively high level athletes from their community, very controlled environment. They come in, they have an ACL reconstruction surgery, and then Enda and their crew followed these athletes over many months as they came back to sport. And then they followed them up to see who went on to suffer an ACL re-injury. And get this, all the conventional things that we typically look at after ACL injury, like your frontal plane mechanics, like how much do your knees kiss in when you jump? No bearing on who got hurt again. All the conventional tests, very similar to what the previous data I showed, really told them nothing, right, about who went on to suffer a re-injury. The quadriceps strength limb symmetry index, right? So how strong are my quads? Didn't tell them much. Here is one of the best predictors that they found here for a future risk of ACL re-injury. It's stiffness, RSI. So what they found in this silhouette is that these were the athletes that actually fared well. And this was in a drop jump test where they stepped off a box and did a jump. And the silhouette that's in the faded in the background is actually the group that did well after their ACL reconstruction surgery, and the group that did not do so well is shown here in the darker silhouette. And what they found was that the group that went on to suffer that re-injury, they displayed longer ground contact times, lower reactive strength index. They displayed this idea of a less stiff whole body spring, if you can imagine. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, wow, I didn't realize this. Like, maybe a lot of the test batteries I'm using in my clinical environment with just looking at single leg hops for distance is not quite enough. And now you might be wondering, well, how am I going to measure this stuff? Because I don't have force plates, I don't have all this stuff. Well, that's what obviously Plantiga can do, is it can help you measure this. So you can actually measure the key things here that in this large scale study published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine was one of the only predictors for a future risk of ACL re-injury. So that's a rhetorical question, but how many of us are actually measuring this based on the most current science that we have on the subject matter? So just a quick touch point. We've done a lot of work in our lab looking at injured athletes, and here what you're seeing is an athlete at 4.5 months post-surgery and another athlete at 7.5 months post-surgery, and we're showing a data from a force plate. But why I wanted to just quickly touch on this is you'll notice the asymmetry that you see. So the green line is her non-injured limb, the blue line is her injured limb. And you'll see it, from 4.5 months to 7.5 months post-surgery, the asymmetries have corrected themselves. That happens to be another thing that you can also measure with the Plantiga insole system, because there's an insole underneath each foot, is you can also measure the right versus left asymmetry as a measure of recovery. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about performance. And the obvious thing here is jumping. And I'm not going to steal Lauren's thunder, because the whole point here is you might be a basketball player, you might be an NFL wide receiver, you might be a volleyball player. But what's super, super key is not only how high do you jump, but how fast do you jump? Because if I am a faster jumper than you, meaning I spend less time on the ground, all things being equal, if you and I both have to jump up to, grab the basketball, or you're trying to defend me, if I can jump faster, that's going to be a competitive advantage for me. So that seems sort of obvious, but I want to touch on something that's a little bit less obvious. Now, as a former endurance athlete, and my previous life, my master's degree is in exercise physiology and muscle physiology, I can tell you that there's 3 determinants of endurance performance. Number one, your VO2 max, relatively genetically determined, right? So you think of your VO2 max, as a key measure of your endurance performance capacity. Number 2 is what we call the anaerobic threshold, which is essentially you're at that point where you're kind of looking at the power you can put out before you tip into a place where you really begin to accumulate the metabolites from anaerobic exercise. And the third thing that's massively important for endurance athletes, and I know this as a strength and power coach who used to work with elite cross-country skiers, is your economy of movement. So your economy of movement, you can think about it like you're driving down the highway at 120 kilometers an hour in your big Ford F-150 versus in your nice little Prius, right? The Prius is more economical, it burns less fuel. And that's a key thing when it comes to endurance performance. Now, endurance athletes typically don't think about jumping. They think about, their cardiovascular function. They think about, all these other pieces of the puzzle. But what individuals like myself who work with elite endurance athletes know, and what many elite endurance coaches of elite endurance athletes know, is that your plyometric ability, your reactive strength, is actually a very important determinant of your running economy in endurance events. So here what this study is looking at the correlation between reactive strength, measured as this reactive strength index, in well-trained distance runners. And it's looking at the relationship between these measures of like stiffness and reactive strength and running economy. And I'll just have you kind of focus in on some of the plots here at the bottom, because notice what's written here, RSI, right? RSI on panels D, E, and F. That's exactly what you're measuring with the Plantiga system. And you can see the nice, strong correlation between RSI and running economy at 12, 14, and 16 kilometers per hour, namely showing that the athletes who had better RSI were also more economical. So if you're an endurance athlete, and we've got tons of them in our movement coaching program, This is an awesome way to monitor not only your neuromuscular readiness for training, but also to get a sense of how economical you are as you move through your training periods, doing your plyometric training, doing your strength training to make sure you're changing the things that matter that are geared towards your performance. Final little bit here, and then I'm going to throw it to Lauren, is just on data quality. I know that there are researchers on the call, and Lauren's already highlighted that, you know, part of what Plantiga's always sort of like prioritized is developing the highest quality data that we can possibly get. So we have a high sampling frequency, 416 hertz for is what these little IMUs are capturing. We place these importantly. It's super hard to actually get this into an insole, but the reason we put this in an insole is that's where you actually minimize movement artifacts. So you think about when you run with a sensor on your hips or on your shoulders, that thing's bouncing around. It's incredibly noisy. The problem we solve with this is that the data quality is very, very, very clean and reproducible. And that accuracy, when you have a sensor that's placed distally on the body, is a massive advantage. And that's actually been shown in some other scientific publications. So what we did, just to give you a bit of background on how we validated RSI, and remember, this isn't an analytical algorithm, meaning that we don't have somebody sitting behind a computer trying to guess where the foot is on and off the ground. What they've done is they've used artificial intelligence to drive the insight. So the machine has learned how to know when the foot is on and off the ground. And one thing about artificial intelligence is it gets better with time. That's the reason why Watson, the IBM computer, can now beat a human in chess, because humans just can't keep up with artificial intelligence. It's kind of scary and amazing all at the same time. But that's what's going on here. And so what we've done is we've actually taken high-level athletes, we've had them jump with the insoles, and they've done this on a dual force plate system where we can measure all sorts of jumps. And then literally the computer learns how to know when the foot is on and off the ground. And just to give you a sense of how this works, this here is the old version, the old algorithm. You'll notice that the error was about 5.2%. So that's the difference between what the insole did and what the force plate did. But look at all these wacky numbers. We had some that were like 30% off, some that were 20% off, 15% off. The computer learns and then goes back and actually improves upon itself. So the newer version, the accuracy improved to 1.3%. And here's something that you all might be interested in, is the newest version of GRIN will be coming out probably in the next couple of months. And that's an actually even better improvement on the accuracy. So one thing you can be sort of rest assured with Plantiga is if you've been out there and it's like, oh, wow, that's weird, it really didn't capture that run or that jump, let us know, because actually what we'll do is we'll train the computer, train the AI, which we affectionately call Norman, named after Quinn's father who passed away. He was one of the founders of the company. We say that Norman's kind of watching underneath your feet to see how you're doing. Well, Norman, the AI, can actually learn through that. So it's just sort of a mention of what the future will look like, is this continual improvement on the accuracy of the system. So to kind of wrap up my section here, I want to just get back to RSI. You know, don't think about RSI as the technical piece. Think about it as HRV for your muscles, right? So it's a measurement of how stiff your suspension is. We obtain that by looking at how long your foot's on the ground and how long it's in the air when you do different types of jumps. You have a couple of different options. You can do this 5 consecutive counter movement jump, which is kind of more knee bend, a bit longer on the ground, or the 10 cyclic hop, which is that pogo hop test. If you are a triathlete, if you're an endurance runner, if you're an athlete and you want to measure your recovery just like you would with your HRV, you know, Whoop or what have you, you can do it 1 time per week after a rest day. That's often how we do that in a high performance environment. And we use it to look at your recovery and readiness. When your RSI is up, that means you're more recovered. When it's down, that means you're sort of in a state of fatigability. Let's say you're coming back after an injury. Maybe it's an Achilles tendinopathy. Maybe it's an ACL rupture. Maybe it's a muscle strain. You can do your testing 1 time per month. Typically, we'll do that as you exit a period of rehabilitation. And it's a great way to quantify how your rehab's going. And remember, for all the clinicians on the call, it's actually probably one of your best predictors of how your patients are going to do after an ACL reconstruction surgery in terms of predicting their wellness and performance, and hopefully fending off that second injury And very importantly with this, it's no longer about sort of that one-off test. You can actually monitor your athletes over time, which is way better than passing the final exam at 9 months and hoping that it goes well over the subsequent, next couple of years. Final point, you might be a volleyball player, you might be a basketball player, you might be an endurance athlete, and you might want to know about performance. How is my RSI improving as it pertains to performance? Well, in this case, another suggestion is to do this 1 time per month or 1 time per training cycle to help quantify your changes over time. And I always say, you got to measure the things that matter and change the things that matter. And if you don't measure, it's hard to change things. So again, coming back to this is one of those really simple aspects of the Plantiga system that can help you around your recovery, performance, and injury rehabilitation. So with that, I'm going to throw over to Lauren and let her show you 3 really cool case studies that can help kind of bang home some of the messages that I tried to tee up in the first part of the presentation. So over to you, Lauren.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So I will start off with one case study here. So this is actually my own data. Quinn touched on it at the start of the webinar about my background, but I played volleyball in the NCAA and I also threw javelin. And I'm a few years out of that, but I still play volleyball very competitively. And I actually use Plantiga all the time on myself to track my performance and to basically create my own training programs. So here's just a sample of the way that I use it in my own performance training. So this is 20 consecutive counter movement jumps where I was max jumping for each jump and trying to see how my reactive strength index was being affected by the fatigue that I was experiencing through this jump. So just as a little reminder here, the consecutive counter movement jump is the one where there's quite a big loading phase compared to the cyclic jump. So a relatively long time spent on the ground, and there tend to be higher jump heights compared to the cyclic jump as well. So the top graph, the raw data there's a lot going on in there, but like Matt said earlier, we use artificial intelligence to basically make sense of that signal and to pull out the jumps and then calculate the reactive strength index from that. So previously, if you wanted to be doing this, you would probably have to be using force plates or video analysis and be calculating this stuff yourself. And it's a very time consuming process, but our algorithms actually do it for you and present it really nicely in the reactive strength index graph that you can see below that. So you can see the first 3 jumps there are, pretty good, sort of trending upwards. But after that, that's where the fatigue really set in, and the RSI really started to go down from there. So there's quite a significant drop from the first jump to the last jump. And RSI is composed of flight time and ground contact time. So in trying to jump as high as you can, you also want to be getting off the ground as fast as you can. So let's actually take a look at those individual metrics and see what was causing the drop in RSI. So this first top graph here, jump height, you can see at the start, I was jumping around 32 centimeters in this test, and by the end it was about 22. So that's a 10 centimeter drop in jump height that you're seeing, which, as a volleyball player, that's pretty significant. That's definitely something that I'd be working on in my training program. But we can also see the ground contact time changes. So for ground contact time, it's a longer ground contact time in this particular style of jump, but it's pretty related to blocking in volleyball. It's a similar movement, even though the hands are on the hips, the legs are sort of reflecting what you'd be doing in a block jump. And in volleyball, you actually end up doing a lot of repeated block jumps if you, for example, are playing against a team that runs a lot of middle balls, which tend to be really quickly. So you need to maybe jump on the setter and then get back up to block and attack, and you actually have to be doing that quite quickly. So ground contact time is a really important metric for something like volleyball or basketball or football or anything like that. And at the start of my test, you can see that my ground contact time was just a bit above 600 milliseconds. So that's a bit longer than half a second. So to put that in context, a second would be like 1, 2, 3. So half of that is what I was spending on the ground at the start of the test. By the end of the test, I was getting up to about 3/4 of a second. And if I were, doing more of these jumps, it would probably be getting pretty close to 1 second between jumps. if you're in a volleyball game and you're spending 1 second on the ground between your jumps, you're probably not going to be making very many blocks, if we're being honest. And that's really a game changer, to be spending that much time and to also be not jumping as high. And so this type of information is really critical in terms of performance for these types of sports, because you need to quantify it in order to know what to change. And so because we can see both the jump height and the ground contact time, we know which one we need to address. In my case, it's both. But for other athletes, it might be only one of those at a time. And then you can cater your training programs to those deficits. So that's just an individual activity. And I also want to take a look at an entire practice session. So we're all athletes and, we're all trying to be the best that we can be, but how many of you actually do a warm-up? And kind of, along the same lines, how many of you actually know whether or not you do a good warm-up? That's a tough question to answer, but we can do that with RSI. So let's just take a look at these graphs here. The first data point was taken before the warm-up. So right after I put my shoes on, I did 5 consecutive counter movement jumps and 10 cyclic jumps. You can see that my RSI for cyclic jumps was 2.38, and for consecutive counter movement jumps, it was 0.93. So, pretty on par. Then I did my full warm-up, did everything that I need to do, including my prehab, including all of my jump, regular warm-up stuff. And you can see that RSI for both types of jumps actually increased. So that's reflecting the neuromuscular readiness that I had been warming up with my warm-up. And so it's very concrete. You can see that what I was doing was working. If, for example, those 2 dots were on the same level, or even if one of them was, or if the post warm-up one were below the first one, then I would probably need to change my warm-up and, help myself be set up for success in the actual practice. So between the second point and the third point, that's where I actually did my full volleyball practice. And so it was quite an intense one. And you can see that's reflected in the RSI as well. So in the cyclic jumps, I went from 2.55 to 2.05, and in counter movement jumps, 1.08 to 0.89. And so that fatigue is really present in the RSI, and it's neuromuscular fatigue. I just wasn't able to get off the ground as quickly or be jumping as high by the end of that practice. So, this is as real as it gets. This is not in a lab. This is literally in a gym collecting this type of data. And it's really relevant to me, and I use it all the time. So that's a sort of power-based case study. Let's talk a little bit about a more endurance-based case study. So consecutive counter movement jumps are really relevant to volleyball or basketball or football or those types of sports. But for running, there's, I would say, a key difference would be the amount of time spent on the ground between strides. So if we compare the cyclic jump protocol, if we watch the video down here, if we compare that to the counter movement jump, the time spent on the ground here is significantly less, kind of tapping your feet on the ground and trying to get up as high as you can. And that ends up being much closer in duration to what you would be doing in running. So for running, depending on the style of running, you might have about 0.2 of a second of ground contact time. If you're sprinting, probably less. If you're jogging, probably more, depending on your activity type. But in the cyclic jump, that time frame is much more similar. And let's actually take a look at that data here. So the ground contact here is just a bit over 200 milliseconds. And as we go through the test, there's an increase in ground contact time of about 25% and a decrease in jump height of about 20%. So the fatigue is really prominent in the cyclic jump as well. And it's more relevant to a running population. And just like Matt spoke about earlier, how running economy is correlated to RSI, this is a good indicator of what you might be missing in your training. So if you're, for example, preparing for an Ironman or a marathon, this can help you determine if you need to ramp up your training, if you need to dial it back, if you're fatigued, those types of things. And we're actually using this currently in our movement coaching program. We have a number of endurance athletes that we're helping to train for Ironmans and marathons. And we use this data quite actively to help them figure out what they need to do and how to help them be their best. So on to the third case study, which is about rehab. So this is also an endurance athlete. But this is in terms of injury. So you'll see there are kind of two clusters on this graph here. The first one to the left of the ankle fracture line would be this athlete's pre-injury baseline. And then in November, there was an ankle fracture, and this person actually had to undergo surgery. So that would be the reason for the lack of points, because obviously right after an ankle fracture, you probably wouldn't be doing cyclic jumps. But once this athlete was able to start doing jumps again, you can see that their RSI numbers started to increase again. So they're definitely trending upwards, but not quite back to the pre-injury baseline. And that's really key here. I mean, this athlete sustained a rather large injury and really wants to get back to where they were before, but they're not quite there yet. And without this type of test, we really wouldn't be able to see that. So that's kind of a large premise of what we do in the movement coaching program is we take this information and we try to derive actionable insights so that we can get you back to your pre-injury baseline and get you back to the performance levels that you were at before. So that's just a quick overview of a few different ways that you can use RSI practically. Yeah, I think that's about all I had. So we'll kind of open it up to any questions that people in the audience might have.
Thanks, Lauren. That was, and Matt, that was great. That was great. I do see some questions coming in. So why don't I kick one off here? I have one coming in from Jeff. Asking what is the difference between the RSI from a consecutive counter movement jump and the cyclic jump? So that kind of pogo quick jump. What's the difference between those RSIs?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kick it off here. And can I just do a radio check, Quinn? Do you got me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. I understood I was a little crackly before, which hopefully everyone heard me. Yeah, so I mean, in a nutshell, I don't want to get too technical. I don't know the person asking the question. I'm not sure exactly what their background is, but when we look at these things, we call them stretch shorten cycles, basically, right? So basically you're jumping, when you land, things stretch, and then you shorten as you come up off the ground. And we can divide stretch shorten cycles into something called fast stretch shorten cycles and slow stretch shorten cycles. So your cyclic hop is an example of a fast stretch shorten cycle. And as Lauren showed, the key thing there is that you're spending like 200 milliseconds, so 0.2 of a second on the ground as you do these repeat jumps. To give you a sense, like Usain Bolt probably spent 90 milliseconds on the ground, so less than 1/10 of a second when he's sprinting. So it's a relatively short ground contact time, which means that your body, you've got to like create even more stiffness in your system to maximize that jump height. The other thing that you probably noticed with the cyclic hop as well is that there wasn't a lot of knee bend. And I'm putting that in kind of lay terms. Lauren's kind of got her knees sort of not locked out, but they're kind of soft, but really it's like this stiff lower limb type action. And there's a lot coming from the ankle joint in terms of how she did her jumping movement. So your cyclic hop, it's a fast, short stretch shorten cycle. It's got lots of relevance for sprinting and any time where you're spending minimal time on the ground. It's got different mechanics of the hip, knee, and ankle. And then when you look at your consecutive counter movement jump, you've got a much larger range of motion, longer ground contact times. There's more capacity for your muscles to develop power. So it's almost like the way I would explain it is in like a cyclic hop, you can think of like your muscles are working like an isometric tensioner almost. So your muscles kind of contract, and then your tendons do a lot of lengthening and shortening as you do the jump. Whereas in that consecutive counter movement jump, you're going to have more muscle work happening, relatively speaking, and it's obviously just longer to apply force. Final point I'll say is that it's context, right? So if I'm working with a long track speed skater, and so speed skating is a gliding sport, they spend a lot of time on the ice, they tend to be really good at something like a consecutive counter movement jump. It's very specific to what they do. On the other hand, if I took an elite sprinter and had them to try to jump like you saw in that video when it was actually Quinn jumping, very often they're just not good at that because that's not how they move. So, you've got a contextual relevance, you've got different things that it's assessing. They're both really informative tests. Sorry to ramble so much there, but that was a really good question.
No, that's awesome. That's helpful. I got a question here from Alex. He says, for the RSI on runners, was the bigger factor just having a short contact time, or was long flight times also important?
I'll hop in here because obviously I put those data in the presentation, and full disclosure, good question. I'm actually not sure, and I have to go back and read the paper again. But that's a really important question that's being asked here. Is that your RSI is a ratio, right? So it's a ratio of how high and how long on the ground. Not to dodge your question, but if I'm looking at RSI, so I'm, as some of you may or may not know, I still work with athletes. I work as a strength and conditioning coach, and I'm using this for monitoring. When I'm looking at RSI from my perspective, I always look at the index, the jump height, and the ground contact time. So I guess I would say in practice, the question is excellent. I don't know the answer to the question, but in practice, I would suggest always measuring all three so you know what's happening. Because one going up and one going down can actually be very informative. An example might be maybe you're spending longer on the ground, but you're jumping higher. That's sometimes a sign of neuromuscular fatigue's present, but RSI stays the same. It's just a slight change in strategy, right? So what you're seeing is that in a fatigue state, I change my strategy to maximize the task, which is how high I'm jumping. And so if I spend longer on the ground, I got more time to apply force, because my jump height's a function of my impulse, which is how much force I put into the ground. If I spend longer, I get more impulse, I can get more jump height, but I've got that extension of how long my feet have been on the ground. So don't know the answer, but practice, always look at all three. That's what we do.
That's awesome. Super helpful. Awesome. Okay, I have another one here from Ian. Should everyone, and this I guess just in terms of, like, we covered some endurance and some volleyball, should everyone be doing jump testing and measuring RSI?
I can start that one off, Matt, and then you can jump in if I miss anything. Everyone is a bit of a broad term. I probably wouldn't tell someone just post-op to go do 10 cyclic jumps. So it would be a bit dependent on the situation. And if you are, for example, injured or recovering from something, you would want to get medical clearance before you start jumping, just so that you know that everything's, structurally sound. But I think there is value for really any type of athlete in jumping. Because the reality is, if you're using your lower legs to accomplish some task in your sport or whatever activity you're doing, then jumping is a really good way to train the vertical component of that. And I would say there are very few sports that don't have a vertical component of movement.
Very true. Maybe golf, maybe. Yeah.
That's
helpful.
I'll just weigh in, again, I want to re-stress this notion that, obviously there are some circumstances where you may want to just sort of like jump into jumping per se, or no pun intended. You haven't jumped before, you don't know how to jump, you got stress fractures, you've got a knee injury. So let's just say the caveat is there may be some situations where your medical professionals, your physicians or your physiotherapists have said, listen, I don't want you jumping right now. So there is your one thing that's a hard no. Fair enough. What I can tell you. So number one, some of the crew that I did back when I was doing my PhD, I spent a lot of time in Denmark. And it's interesting to note that in Denmark, like in Scandinavia in general, my experience has been is they're much more sort of aware of how people are adapting with age. And so they've got really interesting studies with individuals in their 70s and 80s, where they're looking at how muscle power changes with age. Interesting note, your change in muscle power, which is reflected in a jump, is a better predictor of your functionality with age than your strength. And so you will find in their studies that they have done jumping even with people in their 70s and 80s as a functional measure of how your neuromuscular system works with age. So there's an example of scientific research where even people in their 70s and 80s can jump. Now, take that with a grain of salt, right? I'm not saying that you're frail and that you're, there obviously are some bench cases, but there are studies that do that. And a core part of the studies that they've done in Scandinavia and Denmark has used the vertical jump. And that's been a core test. The second thing that I really like about jumping, I'm going to go back to a conversation I had, not to get too technical, but for people on the call who are more in the world of sport performance, is a really well-known individual named Dr. Roger Anoka, who's a specialist in muscle and recovery and whatnot. And I remember talking to Roger at a conference, and I said, Roger, I'm really interested in looking at recovery and fatigue in my athletes. How can I do that? And we were talking about EMG. We were talking about all these sophisticated tools. And he said, Matt, at the end of the day, you want a performance test that you can measure easily, and you want to look at how fatigue processes drop performance. And that's what Lauren showed. And the thing about the vertical jump is we've shown this in our lab, nearly everybody can learn to do it, whether you're young or you're old. We know that it's standardized and it's repeatable. And it's a great indicator of how ready you are, right? It's HRV for your muscles. Really, that's how I look at it. So back to that point, as a general rule, if you're interested in maximizing your performance, if you're interested in monitoring your fatigue over training cycles, if you're interested in, improving the things that matter, particularly around something beyond about how much did you lift in the squat rack, this is a great tool. And I think jumping it's a cornerstone for me. And I'm a bit biased because I've done a lot of my research in that area, but it's standardized, it's repeatable. You can use it in all kinds of populations. It's reliable. It gives us a good appraisal of muscle power along with stretch, shorten cycle ability, AKA reactive strength, right? What we just covered here today. I think it's an excellent test in all kinds of scenarios. That's my personal opinion.
That's awesome and well said. I got a question here from Ainsley, which is interesting. Just asking why Plantiga requires in the jump testing to put the hands on the hips.
I can start that one as well and Matt jump in. It actually helps with standardization and repeatability that Matt just talked about. Because if you're including an arm swing in your jump, there are so many different ways you could use your arms. Some people have better strategies for using their arms and coordinating all of the muscles above their lower limbs. So it just makes it easier to be able to control the outside factors so that you're only testing your lower limb capacity.
Okay, that's awesome. I have another question here from Barry. I guess this is for you, Matt, just asking about the single leg RSI. So that's the single leg jump. Is there a reason why the jump height asymmetry metric is calculated from the max rep and not the average?
Yeah, Barry, I saw your post there, and it's a good question as well. So it's not that I want to sit on the fence here and say that there's no right or wrong answer, but the general rule of thumb is when we average out over a jump, right, it just improves the reliability a little bit. So, generally speaking, for me, when it comes to monitoring, when I'm using this on a routine basis, I'm using this in, a sort of a testing framework where it's going to be ongoing usage. I like the 5 jump average or an average of a number of jumps. But here's the notion around, let's say, rehab is you can think about asymmetries in terms of your movement. And what I would say here is, let's say if I'm walking or running, I'm not perfectly symmetrical ever. Like, I'm always changing a little bit. You can actually see that in our movement patterns when we break it down in the stride by stride analysis on the platform. Is if you're running, on average, you might have a ground contact time asymmetry of 2%, but it kind of changes, right leg a little more than left leg a little more than right, you're kind of bouncing back and forth. And then on average, you look at this notion of movement asymmetry. And what I think is really critical there is when you talk about movement asymmetry, the notion is, are you moving in a rigid way? Like, is there something underlying your movement where you have a distinct asymmetrical gait, asymmetrical movement that really needs attention? The other way to think about this is symmetry in capacity. So if I have a right leg and a left leg, I want the right leg and the left leg to be, first of all, 2 strong limbs, 2 powerful limbs. And I want the power on the right side to be as close as possible to the power on the left side. So the notion here might be, I want to do a sufficient number of efforts of jumping on one leg where I can measure my best jump height. And I do the same on the left side to get to my best jump height. And then I can do a measure of symmetry in capacity to say, how close is my right side to the left side? Now, that's I think philosophically why it's presented the way it's presented. But one of the things that I know we're working on right now with the platform, and I know when the movement coaches sit down every Friday, not only in a single leg jump do we look at capacity, like literally how high did you jump on the right and the left, but we also always consider the average. And I would say, I think when I read your question, Barry, when you popped it up, to me, it looked like you also mentioned RSI in there, not just jump height. That's just my memory. Maybe I misread it. I would always suggest that taking RSI over an average of multiple jumps is key. So I wouldn't look at your best RSI. I would measure it over minimum of 5 up to 10 jumps to get a sense of the average RSI over a series of jumping. Kind of look at RSI like a strategy variable, right? So the performance aspect of jumping is how high did I jump? The strategy part is how long did I spend on the ground? How far did I drop down? How much did I put the brakes on? These are all the things of the components of the jump that lead to how high I jump. And anytime we're looking at those strategy-oriented variables, it always makes sense to capture an average of a few movement cycles in my viewpoint on the matter.
That's awesome. Thank you. Great questions. So that kind of brings us to the end. There's a couple questions that I think we'll bring offline. Matt or Lauren, is there anything else that you'd like to say to kind of wrap it up? And we really appreciate everyone's time today.
No, just thanks so much for everyone coming out and trying to learn a little bit more about one of our favorite metrics. So yeah, we just appreciate having everybody here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just echo that. Very grateful and appreciative of obviously everybody being on the call. Also very grateful and appreciative now to be connecting with so many more people out there, right? Like that's the cool thing about this now. It's like being able to meet people through this technology has been a lot of fun. And I know it's been very rewarding for all of us. So we're just excited to grow the movement coaching program. And like I said, it's a cool technology, but really the power about this is how we're connecting people with people. So, at the end of the day, just really appreciate the opportunity to share. And right, RSI, just think about it. Don't get hung up in like the cool how and what. It's the problem it solves, right? It's RSI is like HRV for your muscles. It's a measure of your recovery. It's a measure of how you're doing after injury. It's a great predictor of functionality after something like an ACL tear. And obviously, as we showed, hopefully important for all types of athletes, whether you're a weekend warrior like me, a volleyball player like Lauren, training for a triathlon or an Ironman or a long distance running race like many of our beta participants or movement coaching participants. It's a cool measure. So that's all I got.
Cool. Well, we'll leave it there. If anybody has any questions or want to reach out, it's L Friedman, Q Sandler, or M Jordan at plantiga.com. So thanks everybody for their time. Until next time.